first sign was so small that most people would have ignored it. On a cold Tuesday morning, Margaret Ellis walked into her kitchen expecting to prepare her usual cup of coffee. Instead of seeing her faithful coffee maker resting in its familiar place beside the window, she found a sleek stainless steel juice machine taking up the entire counter. Her coffee maker had been pushed into a dark corner beside the sink as though it no longer belonged there. Margaret quietly stared at the appliance for a moment. 3 years earlier, her son Daniel and his wife Vanessa had moved into her home. They promised it would only be temporary while they saved enough money for a house of their own. Margaret welcomed them without hesitation. She believed family should help one another. But those 3 years had slowly transformed her peaceful home into a place where she felt like an unwelcome guest. Every month, another small change appeared. Furniture was rearranged without asking. Family photographs disappeared from the walls. Kitchen cabinets were reorganized. Her favorite reading chair somehow ended up in storage. None of it happened overnight. Every change was tiny, almost impossible to complain about. Yet together they quietly erased her presence from the home she and her late husband had built together over 4 decades. Margaret took a slow breath. Without saying a word, she unplugged the expensive juicer, wrapped its cord neatly around the base, and placed it carefully on the lowest shelf of the pantry. Then she returned her coffee maker to its proper place. She brewed a fresh pot, poured herself a cup, and settled beside the window with the morning newspaper. Almost an hour later, Vanessa entered the kitchen wearing an elegant silk robe while scrolling through her phone. She stopped immediately. Her eyes searched the counter. "Where's my juicer?" she asked sharply. Margaret looked up over the edge of her newspaper. "It's in the pantry." Vanessa frowned. "I keep it on the counter." Margaret smiled politely. "I keep my coffee maker there." For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Vanessa seemed ready to argue, but something about Margaret's calm expression discouraged her. Without another word, she opened the pantry, grabbed the juicer, and carried it upstairs. Margaret returned to her newspaper. The silence wasn't a victory. It was simply the first boundary she had restored. Later that week, another surprise waited for her. A handwritten shopping list lay neatly on the kitchen island. There wasn't a greeting. There wasn't a signature. Just a long list of expensive groceries, imported berries, organic almond yogurt, specialty cheeses, truffle oil, premium herbal teas. Margaret picked up the paper and read it carefully. Then she folded it into a small square and dropped it into the kitchen trash. She drove into town that afternoon. Instead of filling 2 overflowing grocery carts like she usually did, she bought only what she personally needed: fresh vegetables, a loaf of bread, salmon, soup, butter, tea. Before driving home, she stopped at an appliance store and purchased a compact refrigerator. The delivery crew placed it inside her private study downstairs. She stocked it with her groceries and quietly closed the door. That evening, Daniel opened the study door with a puzzled expression. "Mom," he said carefully, "did you forget to shop today?" "No." He looked confused. "The kitchen refrigerator is practically empty." Margaret nodded toward the small refrigerator humming softly beside her bookshelf. "My groceries are here." Daniel blinked. "What about ours?" She looked at him kindly. "You and Vanessa both have successful careers. I think it's time you started buying your own food." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "But you've always done the shopping." "I know. And now I'm choosing not to." There was no anger in her voice, no lecture, no criticism, just a quiet decision. Daniel opened his mouth as if searching for the right argument. None came. He slowly nodded before leaving the room. Moments later, Margaret heard Vanessa's frustrated voice echoing through the hallway. She couldn't make out every word. She didn't need to. For the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten: peace. She picked up her novel and continued reading while laughter from happier memories drifted through her mind. She remembered the years when her late husband, Arthur, would bring home fresh flowers every Friday. He used to tell her that a home stayed warm because of love, not expensive furniture. Margaret smiled sadly. She missed him every day. But lately she had begun realizing something important. Love didn't mean allowing people to erase your dignity. Sometimes love required firm boundaries, and sometimes those boundaries arrived far later than they should have. She had no idea that the biggest test of her patience was still waiting just around the corner. Over the next few weeks, Margaret noticed that Vanessa had become quieter, not kinder, simply quieter. She no longer challenged Margaret over little things because she had realized those silent battles were no longer working. Instead, she searched for new ways to regain control of the house. The opportunity arrived on a Saturday morning. Margaret was watering the flowers on the front porch when Vanessa stepped outside, dressed for a shopping trip. "My parents are coming over tonight," she announced casually. "Along with my sister and her husband. We'll eat around 7. Margaret smiled politely. "That sounds nice." Vanessa nodded. "I was thinking a roast beef dinner would be perfect. Maybe mashed potatoes, roasted vegetables, and one of your homemade pies." She turned toward her car without waiting for a reply. Margaret watched her leave. Not once had Vanessa asked whether she was willing to cook. Not once had she even said please. She had simply assumed the meal would magically appear. Margaret returned inside, climbed the stairs, and packed a small overnight bag. She folded 2 sweaters, packed a book, and placed her medications into a travel pouch. Then she called her lifelong friend, Eleanor. "Would you mind having a visitor for the weekend?" Eleanor laughed. "I've been trying to get you over here for months. I'll be there in an hour." When Daniel came inside from mowing the lawn, he found his mother standing by the front door with her suitcase. "Going somewhere?" "I'm spending the weekend with Eleanor." His forehead wrinkled. "But what about dinner?" Margaret looked at him with gentle surprise. "What dinner?" "The one Vanessa planned. I wasn't aware I was responsible for it." Daniel hesitated. "I know you did." She rested a hand on his shoulder. "You both have a fully equipped kitchen. I'm sure you'll manage." Then she stepped outside, climbed into her car, and drove away. Margaret spent the weekend laughing with Eleanor, walking through the local gardens, and enjoying long conversations over tea. For the first time in months, she didn't feel as though she had to tiptoe around someone else's moods. Late Sunday afternoon, one of the neighbors called Eleanor. "You'll never believe what happened last night," she said between laughs. Apparently, Vanessa's guests had arrived dressed for an elegant homemade dinner. Instead, after discovering no food had been prepared, Daniel and Vanessa had panicked. Every nearby restaurant was fully booked. Eventually, they ordered dozens of pizzas. The delivery driver arrived just as Vanessa's parents were complimenting the beautiful dining table. Margaret couldn't help smiling. She hadn't embarrassed anyone. She had simply refused to be taken for granted. The following evening, silence filled the house. Daniel avoided eye contact. Vanessa barely acknowledged Margaret's existence. It suited Margaret perfectly. A few weeks later, winter settled across the town. Snow dusted the rooftops while icy winds rattled the windows. One evening, the 3 of them happened to be sitting in the living room. Daniel watched the evening news. Margaret quietly knitted a wool scarf beside the fireplace. Vanessa scrolled through homes for sale on her tablet. She sighed dramatically. "I can't believe these prices." Daniel nodded absent-mindedly. "We'll find something eventually." Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Eventually isn't good enough." She glanced toward Margaret. "Honestly, I don't understand why your mother keeps holding on to that old family property outside the city." Margaret continued knitting without looking up. Vanessa laughed. "That rundown estate is probably worth next to nothing." Daniel shifted uneasily. "It belonged to Dad's family." "So?" Vanessa shrugged. "It's just abandoned land. Sell it, split the money, and finally help us buy a real house." Margaret counted another row of stitches. She knew something Vanessa didn't. During the past several months, several developers had contacted her. A massive technology district was being built only a few miles from the old property. Land values had skyrocketed. Her late husband's neglected estate had quietly become one of the most valuable parcels in the region. Investors had been competing to buy it. Margaret had already met with lawyers. Independent appraisers had completed their evaluations. Negotiations were nearly finished. but she revealed none of it. Instead, she calmly asked, "If the land is as worthless as you believe, why are you so interested in selling it?" Vanessa smirked. "Because even worthless land is worth something." Margaret smiled softly. "I suppose we'll see." She returned to her knitting. Across the room, Vanessa dismissed the conversation and continued browsing expensive homes she couldn't yet afford. Daniel remained silent. He had no idea that his mother's quiet confidence wasn't stubbornness, it was certainty. By this time next month, everything would change, and neither he nor Vanessa would see it coming. As December approached, the atmosphere inside Margaret's home grew colder than the weather outside. Daniel and Vanessa had finally accepted that Margaret would no longer pay for their groceries or quietly solve every inconvenience. Yet instead of becoming more appreciative, they became increasingly frustrated. Saving for their dream home wasn't happening as quickly as they had expected, and every unexpected expense seemed to spark another argument between them. One evening, Daniel knocked softly on Margaret's study door. "Mom, do you have a minute?" She looked up from the book she was reading and smiled. "Of course." Daniel stepped inside, looking uncomfortable. "Our car needs new winter tires and some repairs. The mechanic says it'll cost around $1,000. Margaret listened patiently. He hesitated before continuing. "We're a little short this month. I was wondering if you could help us out." A few years earlier, she wouldn't have thought twice. She would have written the check before he had even finished speaking. Those days were over. She closed her book and folded her hands. "Daniel, you and Vanessa have lived here rent-free for 3 years. I cover the utilities, property taxes, insurance, and most of the household expenses. That's already a significant amount of support." "I know," Daniel replied quietly. "I'm happy to provide a roof over your heads while you get back on your feet, but I won't continue financing your lifestyle." Daniel lowered his eyes. "It's only $1,000. Margaret opened a drawer and removed several household bills. She placed them on the desk. "Take a look." Daniel scanned the figures. The electricity bill, the heating bill, the water charges, property maintenance. Everything had increased since 2 more adults moved into the house. "I've never asked either of you to contribute toward these costs," Margaret said gently. "I think that's been generous enough." Daniel sighed heavily. "I understand." "I hope you do." Without another word, he picked up the papers and quietly left the room. Margaret watched the door close behind him. It hurt her to refuse her own son, but allowing someone to depend on you forever wasn't kindness. Sometimes it was the opposite. Only a week later, Vanessa made her boldest move yet. Margaret returned home from an afternoon walk carrying a small bag of library books. As soon as she reached the 2nd floor, she stopped. Her favorite reading room had been completely rearranged. The comfortable armchair where she had spent countless evenings reading had been pushed into the hallway. Her bookshelves stood against another wall. Boxes filled with office supplies covered the floor. Inside the room, Vanessa stood, measuring the windows while speaking on her phone. "Yes," she said confidently, "the desk will fit perfectly right here." She finally noticed Margaret standing in the doorway. "Oh, you're back." Margaret waited quietly. "I'm turning this room into my home office," Vanessa explained. "You'll have to move your things downstairs. That little room near the laundry area should be fine for you." Margaret didn't respond. She simply turned around and walked away. Vanessa smiled to herself, believing the conversation was over. An hour later, a pickup truck stopped outside the house. 2 local college students climbed out carrying moving blankets and dollies. Margaret greeted them warmly. "I'd appreciate your help putting a room back the way it belongs." Within 30 minutes, every bookshelf, chair, table, and lamp had been returned to its original position. Vanessa's computer, files, and office equipment were carefully carried into the small downstairs room she had suggested for Margaret. When everything was finished, Vanessa stormed into the hallway. "What do you think you're doing?" Margaret calmly thanked the students before closing the front door. Then she turned toward Vanessa. "I've restored my reading room." "I need that space." Margaret met her eyes without raising her voice. "This house belongs to me." Vanessa folded her arms. "I live here too." "You do," Margaret nodded. "But living somewhere doesn't make you the owner." She reached into her pocket and removed a small brass key. From that day forward, Margaret began locking every private room whenever she left the house. The message required no further explanation. Boundaries had finally been established. Vanessa realized she could no longer move things, make decisions, or treat the home as though it belonged to her. She was furious. Margaret, however, felt strangely peaceful. Meanwhile, something far more important was happening beyond those walls. The negotiations for the old family estate were finally complete. The contracts had been signed. Only one final bank transfer remained. Margaret checked her calendar that evening and smiled quietly. In less than 2 weeks, the biggest secret she had carried for months would finally become impossible to hide. And when that day arrived, every assumption Vanessa had made about her would collapse in a matter of seconds. Christmas arrived wrapped in fresh snow, sparkling lights, and silent expectations. Vanessa threw herself into planning the perfect holiday dinner. She ordered expensive decorations, arranged elegant centerpieces, and carefully assigned seats around the dining table. Every detail reflected the image she wanted her family to see: a successful young couple living in a beautiful home. Margaret watched everything unfold without interference. She decorated a small Christmas tree in the sitting room with ornaments she and her late husband, Arthur, had collected over the years. Each ornament carried a memory, one that meant far more to her than any expensive decoration. 3 days before Christmas Eve, Vanessa approached her while she was making tea. "We're expecting quite a few guests," Vanessa said pleasantly. "I've arranged the seating." Margaret stirred her tea and smiled. "That's thoughtful. I've placed you at the end of the table near the kitchen door. It'll be quieter there, and if you get tired, you can slip away without disturbing everyone." The words were polite. The meaning wasn't. Margaret understood exactly what Vanessa was saying. "You don't belong with the rest of us." She simply nodded. "That will be perfectly fine." Vanessa smiled, satisfied that her plan had gone unquestioned. What she didn't know was that Margaret had already received the call she'd been waiting for. Earlier that morning, her attorney confirmed that the sale of Arthur's family estate had officially closed. The payment had cleared. $90 million now rested safely in Margaret's account. She felt no excitement, only peace. Money had never been her goal. Freedom had. Over the next 2 days, she quietly packed important documents, treasured photographs, family heirlooms, and a few favorite books into 2 suitcases stored neatly in the trunk of her car. Everything else could wait. Christmas Eve arrived. The house filled with laughter, perfume, expensive coats, and the aroma of roasted turkey. Vanessa's parents admired the decorations. Her sister complimented the dining room. Daniel moved nervously between the kitchen and living room, making sure everyone had enough to eat and drink. Margaret remained gracious to every guest. She smiled, she listened, she enjoyed the conversations. When dinner was served, everyone took their assigned seats. Margaret quietly sat where Vanessa had placed her, at the far end of the table near the kitchen door. She didn't mind. She no longer measured her worth by where she sat. Dessert arrived an hour later. As coffee was poured, Vanessa leaned back in her chair with a confident smile. "So, Margaret," she asked loudly enough for everyone to hear, "did anyone ever buy that old property your husband left you?" Every conversation stopped. Margaret folded her napkin neatly beside her plate. "Yes," she answered calmly. "I sold it." Vanessa laughed. "Really? That's surprising." She looked around the table. "I guess even abandoned land has some value." Then she turned back toward Margaret. "So how much did you get for it?" Margaret took a sip of coffee before answering. $90 million. Silence. Absolute silence. The room seemed to freeze. Vanessa stared without blinking. Her father nearly dropped his wine glass. Her mother slowly lowered her fork. Daniel looked at his mother as though he had misheard her. "I'm sorry," Vanessa whispered. "Did you say 90,000? Margaret shook her head. 90 million. No. The property became part of a major technology development project. Several companies competed to purchase it. She spoke as calmly as if discussing tomorrow's weather. The contracts were completed weeks ago. The funds arrived yesterday. Vanessa's confident smile disappeared. Her face turned pale. Daniel leaned forward. "Mom, why didn't you tell us?" Margaret looked at him gently. "Because it was my business." No one spoke again for several moments. The cheerful holiday atmosphere had vanished. Every assumption Vanessa had made about her mother-in-law had collapsed in less than a minute. The quiet widow she believed needed everyone else's approval had become the wealthiest person in the room. Yet Margaret hadn't changed at all. She was still the same calm, respectful woman she had always been. Only now everyone else finally understood how badly they had underestimated her. The remainder of the evening passed in awkward silence. Guests left much earlier than expected. Vanessa suddenly became unusually polite, offering Margaret coffee, dessert, and even helping her clear the table. Margaret thanked her kindly but declined every offer. She already knew that kindness born from money wasn't kindness at all. Early the next morning, she would make one final decision, and this time, there would be no turning back. Christmas morning dawned bright and peaceful. Fresh snow covered the front lawn and sunlight reflected from every rooftop. Margaret woke early, dressed warmly, and carried the final suitcase downstairs. Daniel and Vanessa were already waiting in the kitchen. 2 steaming cups of coffee sat on the table. Vanessa stood as soon as Margaret entered. "Good morning," she said with an unfamiliar smile. "Would you like some breakfast? We were hoping we could talk." Margaret placed her purse on a chair. "I have a few things to discuss as well." Daniel looked relieved. "I'm glad. Last night came as quite a surprise." Margaret reached into her handbag and removed a slim folder. She placed it gently on the table. Daniel opened it. His expression slowly changed. "What is this?" "It's a lease agreement," Margaret answered calmly. Vanessa frowned. "A lease?" Margaret nodded. "I've decided it's time for a change." Daniel looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I'm moving into my new home today." Silence filled the kitchen. Vanessa spoke first. "You're moving?" "Yes, but this is your home." "It has been." Margaret smiled gently. "Now it's time for a different chapter in my life." Daniel looked down at the papers again. "The lease says we'll begin paying market rent on January 1st. "That's correct." "And utilities?" "You'll be responsible for those as well." Vanessa's face lost its color. "We can't afford this." Margaret met her eyes. "Then you'll need to find a home that fits your budget." "You can't expect us to leave." "I expect nothing," Margaret replied calmly. "I'm simply ending an arrangement that was always meant to be temporary." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "You never said anything." "I didn't need to." She paused before continuing. "For 3 years, I watched my home become a place where I no longer felt welcome. I allowed it because I wanted to help my family." She looked at both of them. "Helping someone should never require giving up your dignity." Neither of them answered. Margaret picked up her coat. "I've hired a professional property management company. They'll handle all future arrangements." Vanessa's voice trembled. "We're family." Margaret nodded. "Yes, we are." "Then why are you doing this?" "Because family should respect one another." The words were spoken softly, yet they carried more weight than any argument. Margaret walked toward the front door. Daniel hurried after her. "Mom." She stopped. "I'm sorry." She turned slowly. For the first time in years, she saw genuine regret in her son's eyes. Not regret over the money, not regret over the house, regret for allowing distance to grow between them. Margaret stepped closer and gently squeezed his hand. "I love you, Daniel. I love you too. I hope one day we can rebuild our relationship." His eyes filled with tears. "So do I." She hugged him tightly before walking outside. The front door closed quietly behind her. There were no raised voices, no dramatic farewell, only silence. Margaret drove several hours into the mountains where her new lakeside home waited. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't extravagant. It was exactly what she had always dreamed of. Large windows overlooked calm blue water. A wide cedar deck stretched toward the shoreline. Tall pine trees surrounded the property, filling the air with the scent of fresh wood. She carried her luggage inside and stood in the middle of the living room. For the first time since Arthur had passed away, she felt completely at peace. Over the following months, she settled into a life she had postponed for far too long. She traveled whenever she wished. She joined a local book club. She supported charities that helped widows, students, and struggling families build better futures. Rather than allowing wealth to change her, she used it to improve the lives of others. Daniel called from time to time. Their conversations were brief at first, but slowly became warmer. He and Vanessa eventually rented a modest apartment they could honestly afford. Life taught them lessons that money alone never could. Margaret never reminded them of the past. She believed true forgiveness wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about refusing to let those memories control the future. One quiet spring morning, she sat on her deck with a cup of coffee, watching gentle ripples move across the lake. Birds sang from the nearby trees. The breeze carried the scent of blooming wildflowers. She smiled as the sunlight danced across the water. Arthur had once told her that a peaceful home wasn't measured by its size or its price. It was measured by the respect shared within its walls. Now, at last, she understood exactly what he meant. She had not found happiness through wealth. She had found it by reclaiming her self-respect. And that, she realized as she lifted her coffee toward the morning sun, was the greatest gift she could ever give herself.